Good afternoon, and we're back here in the washroom press, and we're still on the series of Plastercast printmakings. So in front of me I have, this is a very thin piece, I'm just trying to be economical with my plaster, you can see, a basic just mould. Again, I used my silicone cake mould, similar to the one I used in the previous videos, and there's a straight up plaster cast, nothing set in it. And what I've done on the top surface, I just have rubbed some earth pigment. So this is an inert, non-toxic one. Amazing from Clearwell Caves. It's absolutely brilliant. British purple ochre. But it's inert, so I know, it's not a nasty one. And I just used a rag to rub in to the top surface so I can see what my marks are going to be when I start mark making. Now you'll also notice as I rubbed, for some reason some grit got in the bottom of my plastercast mould, which is a little bit annoying, but actually for this particular exercise it's going to be quite interesting. But you can see these marks here, so those are the lower areas which have not picked up the top surface of the ochre. Now the reason I have rubbed a pigment in the top surface is because what we're going to be doing with this plastercast sort of tile, let's call it, so we're going to be scratching into the surface, and then we're going to be inking it up black and taking a relief print from it. Got some tools here which we're going to be using for the scratching in, and on camera it's very difficult for the viewer to see white on white, so I literally put this pigment on top so you're able to see what marks I'm going to be making. At home it's not necessary for you to do this. In fact, I would encourage you not to, because the pigment can affect the black ink when we ink it up. It's purely for the camera, hence why it's red. And it is just literally a tile, flat tile, nothing fancy. It hasn't cured overnight. I cast this about 20 minutes ago, so it's still sort of it's still softish, not soft enough obviously to crumble, I can pick it up, it's quite sturdy, but it's still cool to the touch, it's still warm to the touch, it's still got a lot of moisture in there. And that is useful because when we start using these tools up here, a slightly softer plaster, so not a fully cured plaster, slightly soft plaster scratches more easily. You can get more gentle marks into it and more effective marks. So I have in front of me here a series of tools. Just move those up here. Now I've moved the pigment. They are all things you can probably find around the house. In essence, they all have a scratching ability, a surface scratching ability. Zester, palette knife, an awl, etching needle, roulette, knife, sandpaper, rock, all of them can scratch into the top surface. So I'm just going to start making a series of, I'm going to be quite pragmatic about my mark making because this is an exercise in showing you what it can do. So I'm just going to make a series of, some of these are very gentle, and I'm sure on the camera probably slightly trickier to see, but I will hold it up at the end. This is a little dressmaking tool. I use it a lot in my workshops, and you'll be able to see that throughout the videos. Etching needle. You can also use an awl if you happen not to have an etching needle. It's just basically a sharp point. So even a very sharp, thin knitting needle, dressmaker's pin. And I'm not going really deep here because the plaster is still curing. It's not completely hard. It's quite easy for me to scratch into it. If the plaster has been completely cured, say for 48 hours, and it's really hard, scratching it becomes quite labour intensive and also can risk not creating a clean line, especially when doing curves. And this is going to be a relief print, so you're working on literally the top surface. So anything that is below that surface will appear as a white line. Sorry, this is going to make a horrible sound. Yes, go on.
Why do you have so many tools?
Why do I have so many tools? Well, because this is an educational workshop video, let's say, people at home might not have all these tools. They might only have, say, this tool. And so it's useful for them to see how this tool operates. But some people might have these two tools. So now I can demonstrate how the two tools work. Some people might have all of the tools. So it's useful to show a range of tools to give people options out there of how they mark make. And you'll notice I'm on a cloth here. This is just to prevent it slipping around on my plastic coated plan chest. You'll also notice it just kicks up little bits of, damp plaster. Just move those to the side. Try not to blow them off, because obviously as soon as you start blowing plaster around it becomes something that risks being breathed in, and you don't really want that. This is the zester. So I'm zesting the plaster. But look at that.
Wow.
Oh, that's so satisfying.
I know.
Yeah, I love it as well, Granny. It is one of the most satisfying things to zest. Zester printmaking plate. So you see, I just tapped that off rather than blew it, because blowing it just gets everywhere, because you are kicking up a little bit of dust. If you are concerned and you are using really fine tools and there is dust, please wear a face covering. Obviously, I think we all have some of those now, or outside. Mine is still very wet. But you can see already clearly the type of marks we're getting. Gosh, that zester is so satisfying.
Yeah.
So I've done the zester, I've done those. Let's start organising which ones I've done. Did the etching needle. The awl is very similar to the etching needle, but slightly sort of chunkier line. And you don't have to go too deeply, and this is what also the pigment's showing you. As long as you go through the top surface, as with any relief print, then it's going to make a mark. I'm just going to get really scratchy there. Okay. Now I've got the micro cheese grater, nutmeg grater, who knows, various different attachments. I'm going to grate it a bit. Ooh. And let's do the fine bit. Oh, I do laugh at myself sometimes. Right, there we go. Just going to tap that off gently. When you do tap it, just be gentle. You don't want it, especially if it's a thin piece, you don't want it to suddenly go and crack. Yes, Granny. You need to use all of them, you say. Yes. Yeah, I know. I'm running out of space, aren't I? Old craft knife should, in theory, create incredibly thin lines. So I'm going to start filling in some details now. And when this is completely cured, so sort of 48 hours depending on your plaster, all these little sort of really fine bits of plaster being kicked up at the moment, just take a soft brush to them and brush them off. Do it outside somewhere, away from all your artwork, because you really don't want that hanging around. And just don't worry about trying to smudge them off now, because that will affect the surface of your plaster, because it's still damp. Any movement across it will affect it. I've got here a giant piece of concrete, which actually creates, some interesting, unpredictable marks. And lastly, if I'm just going to give that gentle tap off, just get rid of this. So you see, I'm not going to brush these bits off, because again, that will, all these lovely fine lines we've created, which are raised up, as soon as I start brushing them off onto the damp plaster, it smooths off the plaster surface, so you lose the detail. Now the palette knife, I'm going to, just whilst I'm here, I'm going to smooth off the edges. Which is useful, because when you put a roller across the top surface, you don't want the edges to catch the roller and damage it. So that is useful to do now anyway. Whilst the plaster is still slightly damp, so about after 20 minutes, half an hour after casting it, because otherwise it will chip, and the chips will just chip in all the wrong places and just be infuriatingly annoying. So I just took off the edge there. And you can also use, chisels and things if you're going to go really quite aggressive into it, which isn't a problem obviously. If you're going to start digging into the plaster, that is kind of best done when it's completely set, and cast yourself a nice chunk of plaster. Go a lot thicker than I have, because when you start hitting into the plaster and creating an impact, a very thin piece like this risks, you know, just shattering. So cast yourself a good inch or so, and the chisels you really can, you know, chisel into it. But remember, there's no point in creating a beautiful sculpture of chiseling marks underneath the top surface, because this is purely acting on the top surface. It's a relief print. And lastly, standard sandpaper. Just going to fill in a few holes where I can.
Whoa.
Some of these very fine marks will fill in. There we go. The chaos has started. Okay. So, as I said, I'm not going to brush that off. Just going to give it a tap. I'm just going to come around and hold it slightly to the camera, so you can see the range of marks we're getting. And the ochre is very useful to show what type of relief surface we're going to be getting. As I say, when you're using an oil-based ink, it will fill in slightly, so you will lose some of that detail. But you know, some of the stronger marks will definitely be there. Things like the sandpaper tend to fill in a bit. But you can see how expressive it can be, which is absolutely brilliant. Again, mine was cast very thinly. If you're doing this at home and you're wanting to really go for it, cast it a lot deeper. Give yourself a nice thick tile. What we're going to do with that now, I'm going to leave that to dry for 48 hours, so it's completely and utterly dry. What I usually do, and I haven't got it to hand, I just put one of these, I usually rest it on top of something, obviously something a bit more stable than that. You know, 2 mugs or something, because then air can circulate underneath, so it dries it all around and the moisture can evaporate. Now, plaster obviously has a reaction internally, but it does help if you have air circulation. So that's left for about 48 hours, after which you can then brush off very gently with a soft brush all these residual bits. Again, just be careful of the dust, take appropriate precautions with that. And then once my one's done, in the next video we'll be inking up and printing, and of course this is all printed by hand, which is absolutely brilliant. So there we go, have fun, enjoy it. It's really satisfying going into plaster, but just be aware of the drying time. The longer it's cured, the more chances of chipping and things like that. So try and work at this sort of stage. Brilliant. And we'll be back to ink that up in 2 days or so.